The political terminology of left versus right dates back to the seating arrangement of the National Assembly during the French Revolution. Those sitting on the left side were the reformers, animated by the French Enlightenment's ideals of universalism, individualism, rationalism, and progressivism. Sitting on the right side were the defenders of traditional order who sought to preserve their civilization against revolutionary restructuring. Thus, the left traces back to an essentially revolutionary force in service of French Enlightenment values, opposed by the preservative and restorative forces that came to be known as the right. Although the political labels of left and right may only trace back a few centuries, the opposition they describe is very ancient. To understand the left-right dichotomy, we will delineate the divide at 3 levels of analysis. 1. Biopsychological, 2. Moral ideological, and 3. Politico-structural. Let's begin with first principles. To understand the political, we start with biology, because, as Michael McConkie puts it, the Rosetta Stone of human behavior is fitness. Every preference, norm, narrative, and institution ultimately orients, directly or indirectly, around survival and reproduction. What we call politics is the way different groups, and different personality types within those groups, secure their fitness interests. Within every species, nature experiments with variation. Different phenotypes, expressed patterns of physical, cognitive, and behavioral traits, thrive under different conditions, and therefore enact different strategies. Consider the famous case of the moths in 19th century England. When soot blackened the trees, dark-winged moths suddenly gained a survival advantage over white ones. A minor change in environment shifted which phenotype was favored. Like moths and any other organism, human individuals exist along a broad reaction norm, a range of heritable behavioral expressions that can emerge depending on environmental inputs. Different conditions favor different points along this range, producing distinct behavioral types. Now, organisms do not merely adapt to their environments, they adapt their environments to themselves. The beaver's dam, built to form the pond that supports its lodge, is an extension of the beaver's phenotype into the world. Humans likewise extend their phenotype into their environments. Human tools, technologies, institutions, laws, and moral systems are all extensions of phenotype, ways of reshaping the social and physical environment to favor our particular fitness interests. Different human types build different kinds of environments, because each seeks to reproduce itself under the conditions that it finds optimal. The Canadian scientist and political theorist Michael McConkie applies the logic of phenotypic extension to human societies and shows that there is a war between two ends of the phenotypic spectrum pursuing distinct evolutionary strategies. On the one end, you have spatials, or space-biased extended phenotypes, and on the other end, temporals, or time-biased extended phenotypes. Spatials are high in openness and low in conscientiousness. They think in terms of universal laws, abstract systems, and contractual relations. They prefer bureaucratic structure. They thrive in conditions of abundance, mobility, and diversity, and their adaptive payoff is exploration, innovation, and artistry. Temporals, on the other hand, are high in conscientiousness and lower in openness. They think in terms of local customs, concrete orders, and personal relationships. They prefer evolved, traditional structure. They thrive in conditions of scarcity, stability, and high trust, and their adaptive payoff is restraint and continuity. Personality psychology shows that across populations, those high in openness tend toward liberal spatial worldviews, while those high in conscientiousness incline toward conservative temporal views. These traits are heritable and stable across life, making them a psychological bridge between biology and ideology. Each phenotype seeks to mold the world in its own image, extending itself into the social and institutional environment. Ideologies, in this light, are rationalizations of temperament, the stories different phenotypes tell to justify their evolutionary preferences. The Canadian professor Harold Innis, studying the media of empires, observed that civilizations oscillate between space-biased and time-biased orientations. Space-biased societies, geared toward expansion and administration, favor lightweight, portable, easily distributable media like papyrus, print, or digital code, which allow coordination across vast distances and of mass populations. Time-biased societies societies, emphasizing continuity and lineage, favor heavier, more durable, less replicable, and distributable media like oral tradition, stone, or parchment. Innes used various examples, including ancient Egypt, to illustrate his point. Early Egypt was profoundly time-biased. Its temples and stone inscriptions embodied permanence and emphasized sacred continuity. Later, the invention and spread of papyrus enabled bureaucratic coordination and centralized rule, tilting Egypt toward spatial administration. It's important to note here that it was not the discovery of papyrus that led to the proliferation of the spatial phenotype, but the other way around. The rise of spatial phenotypes, abstracting, managerial, priestly kinds of minds, required, and so produced, an appropriate medium for the social order that suited them. Similar transitions have occurred in many civilizations, such as Rome and medieval Europe, where shifts from oral to written, or from parchment to print, mirrored the transition in the dominant phenotype. This alternation, where temporal order and production gives rise to spatial consumption and expansion, and spatial expansion collapses back into temporal restoration, is the pulse of cyclical history. Eras of scarcity select for temporal phenotypes, who are disciplined, cohesive, and duty-bound, who create stability and build high-trust societies. Temporal order then breeds prosperity, which relaxes selection pressures, giving rise to more spatial phenotypes, who take advantage of the abundance and whose innovation drives growth, but eventually overextends and undermines the temporal foundations that made it possible, and the ensuing crisis restores temporal order again. The political conflict we call left versus right is thus the surface expression of this deeper biological feedback loop, a war of phenotypes recurring through time. Before we move on, let me clarify that neither phenotype is good or bad per se. Spatial types give us explorers, artists, entrepreneurs, engineers, and theorists, the people who discover new frontiers and invent new models and tools. Temporal types give us craftsmen, farmers, fathers, and warriors, the people who defend borders, uphold standards, fulfill obligations, and transmit a way of life across generations. Ideally, the spatial impulse would be utilized yet constrained by temporal order. One can picture the relationship as a kind of toroidal field. Energy expands outward, but curves back around and is drawn back inward by the limiting force. The task of the right is not to extinguish the spatial phenotype, but to constrain it within the bounds set by the long-term interests of the group. We now move from the fundamental biopsychological layer of analysis to the moral ideological one. This is where biology gets expressed in doctrine, what is called a political formula, which portrays the current regime's rule as morally right, necessary, or natural. When the spatial type, naturally open, novelty-seeking, boundary-transgressing, has its preferences elevated and codified as a worldview, it takes the form of liberalism. Although spatial phenotypes are nothing new, liberalism did not appear until very recently. Earlier civilizations certainly went through phases of spatial dominance, but due to certain material necessities and limits on scale, they remained anchored in temporal forms of order like religion, hierarchy, and local obligation. Only once those temporal constraints began to break down could the spatial type universalize its preferences and project its psychology into an explicit ideology. The rise of several factors, including printing and mass literacy, modern financialism, Protestant individualism, and Enlightenment faith and reason, created the first environment in which a rising merchant financial administrative class, rich in spatials, concentrated in cities, armed with leverage over the state, and incentivized to dissolve temporal restraints, could progressively erode the old concrete social order, wielding liberalism as the new dogma. Thus emerged the first worldview totally expressive of the unbound spatial mind, fully realized in the French Revolution. Liberalism is built on four essential pillars. Let's examine each in turn along with their illiberal counterparts. Universalism versus particularism. Universalism is based on the presumption that what makes us all the same is more important than what makes us distinct. Humans all walk upright and bleed red, therefore, so the reasoning goes, we must be fundamentally interchangeable. The universalist does not just overlook differences, he resents them. Group identities, natural status hierarchies, asymmetrical gender roles, national borders, all such distinctions should be loosened, blurred, or abolished. Universalism is the ideology of entropy, moving to level, dissolve, and homogenize. When it comes to moral obligation, because the universalist horizon of care has no limiting principle, one is effectively relieved of one's actual duties to one's parents, children, community, and nation, as all concrete obligations are dissolved into an undifferentiated slush of sentimental concern. Particularism is based on the opposite presumption, that what matters most is not what makes us all the same, but what makes us distinct. Particularism understands that moral life is contextual and agent relative. fathers have different duties than sons, Englishmen than Chinese. Duties are objective, but they are asymmetrical and indexed to role, rank, people, and context. Particularism enables clear friend-enemy distinctions to be maintained, group identity and capital to be preserved, and actual morality to be operationalized. You know who you owe what, in what order, and on what grounds. Individualism versus corporatism. Individualism is based on the social ontology of part before whole, and is a downstream result of universalism, because once particular groups are delegitimized, all social bodies, from families to nations, are merely collections of consenting atoms. The liberal wants to live in a fluid world of contracts and customers, resents unchosen ties, and defines freedom as freedom from others. The end result of individualism is the cosmopolitan bugman, a rootless specialist who can live anywhere because everywhere is the same shopping mall. Individualism is the preferred social ontology of the merchant and managerial class, breaking men out of estates and corporate orders into atomized units where they're easy to manage from above and to steer with prices and propaganda. Corporatism, on the other hand, places the whole before the part, viewing the group as more than the sum of its parts, not a heap of atomic individuals, but an organic body with organs. Families, guilds, classes, estates, regions, each with its own dignity and collaborative function. Corporatism recognizes that the strength of the group is a necessary prerequisite for rights and liberties of its individual members, and so economic and political life are to be ordered around the interests of these bodies. Freedom here is intelligible only within the group, as a dividend of cooperation, or freedom through others, not from them. Corporatism embeds persons within intermediary social bodies which mediate between them and the state, giving their members identity, recognition, and protection. Rationalism versus traditionalism. Rationalism, which places theory over praxis, is the Enlightenment disease of thinking that you can design a whole moral and political order from an armchair, starting with abstract man scrubbed of his history, caste, and customs. Instead of reasoning within a living tradition, it tries to deduce principles prior to it, as if societies were theorems to be derived. Anything that cannot be neatly justified in universal terms is suspected of prejudice or superstition, and the rationalist feels an almost missionary urge to tear down the arbitrary fences erected by his ancestors. Rationalism is the hubristic epistemology of the managerial class, the belief that society is clay for planners, to be engineered by clever people with diagrams, ignoring the limits of knowledge, the weight of tradition, and the stubbornness of human nature. Traditionalism, by contrast, is the epistemic humility to place praxis over theory and defer to tradition, recognizing that truth is ultimately verified by endurance, that something is true because it is tried and true, that knowledge accumulated in a living tradition over billions of man-hours through generations of trial, error, and refinement is the primary authority to which reason and reform must defer. The traditionalist sees tradition as an evolved toolkit of norms like patriarchy, hierarchy, and ethnocentrism that have survived because they work. He knows that the older the institution, the less arbitrary it is, and where the rationalist sees the past as dead weight, the traditionalist applies the Lindy rule. The longer a form of life has lasted, the more likely it is to be reliable. Traditionalism does not ban innovation and creativity, but disciplines them, because it knows we are not smarter than our ancestors. Progressivism versus realism. Progressivism is the cult belief that history has a built-in moral arrow, and that anything old, inherited, or rooted is suspect by definition. Progressivism resents natural limitations and biological determinism, and so expresses itself as a bio-Leninist revolution of victim hierarchies and marginal types, mobilized to replace the center with the periphery, natives with minorities, and the natural elites with the natural underclass. Progressivism is wielded by the state to promise an ever-improving human condition, racism-free, carbon-free, suffering-free, and this impossible telos becomes the permanent excuse for more social engineering, more bureaucracy, and more intrusion, in the name of being on the right side of history. Realism, by contrast, is just the recognition of the way things work. There are inviolable regularities in human and political life just as in physics. Entropy increases, birds of a feather flock together, promiscuity collapses society, democracy decays into oligarchy, etc. You can declare the people are sovereign, or that sex and race are social constructs, but nature does not answer to parliamentary resolutions. Liberalism's overarching theme is an irresponsible revolt against all that is fixed and unchosen, while illiberalism is characterized by a sober acceptance of inheritance and nature's constraints. To avoid confusion, I'm not saying that all spatials are inherently resentful people, but rather that when spatial preferences get elevated to the level of unquestionable axioms, the hard limits and inequalities inherent to the world start to look like injustices, inviting them to treat reality as oppression and to turn moral outrage against the very structures their group needs to survive. Having traced the left-right divide through its biological and ideological expressions, we now turn to the third diagnostic axis, the structural form of political power. This layer is concerned with the machinery of governance itself, the concrete institutions through which elites coordinate society. At this level, the choice is between two structural poles: monist, centralized, managerial orders on one end, and pluralist, decentralized, aristocratic orders on the other. Although monism is not necessarily liberal, liberalism is inherently monist. By its own logic, each of liberalism's core commitments requires a central authority to administer and enforce it. Universalism rejects hierarchical and qualitative distinctions, requiring central authority to enforce uniform rules across culturally distinct and inherently unequal groups. Individualism disembeds persons, leaving them dependent on the state to arbitrate disputes, supply aid, and coordinate labor. Rationalism delegitimizes custom and inherited authority, legitimizing a managerial priesthood of credentialed experts and procedures to govern in their stead. And progressivism requires a permanent class of managers with an open-ended mandate to intervene in ever more domains for purposes of social improvement. So we see that liberalism does not merely tolerate managerial monism, it produces it. To understand where the true right lies along the politico-structural axis, we need to understand group evolutionary strategy. Various ecological constraints and competitive pressures like geography, internal demographics, and population size select for a particular mode of coordination and a particular dominant institution. China converged on the bureaucratic state as its dominant institution, the Middle East on the theocratic state, and the West on law, backed by militia. China centralized early because its ecology of flat river basins, high-yield millet and rice agriculture, dense population, and a pair of long centrally oriented rivers lowered the cost of empire and favored bureaucratic monism. The Middle East centralized for its own particular set of reasons, leading to a kind of priestly totalitarianism. Europe, by contrast, could not centralize. Unlike the Middle East, Egypt, and China, which possessed long linear river valleys with predictable seasonal flooding, enabling irrigation agriculture, concentrated populations along a single transport spine, and flat terrain for rapid military projection, Europe had short, discontinuous rivers running in different directions, no predictable agriculture-shaping floods, and a fractal landscape of mountains, forests, and microecologies. These ecological features, along with Europe's competitive Indo-European descended warrior aristocracy, made large-scale centralization prohibitively costly and reinforced the pattern of distributed sovereignty rather than monism. For this reason, the West's true right is structurally pluralist and aristocratic in ethos. Pluralism is the stable equilibrium generated by the European group evolutionary strategy. This illustrates an important, broader principle. The political right is whatever successfully operationalizes a group's evolutionary strategy. The Chinese right is monist, bureaucratic, and Confucian because China's group strategy prizes stability, harmony, and administrative unity. The European right is pluralist, aristocratic, and competitive because Europe's group strategy was built on distributed sovereignty, maximizing agency and innovation. In every case, the right is the guardian and optimizer of the group strategy, the normative and institutional pattern that allows a people to persist themselves across time. This also brings to relief the contrasting essence of the political left. The left is that which directly or indirectly undermines the group evolutionary strategy, disabling group persistence. The social scientist Kurt Doolittle replaced the political compass with the political triangle because the compass forces politics into two ideological axes, left-right and authoritarian-libertarian, but politics isn't really about ideological preference, it's about reproductive and group evolutionary strategy, expressed through institutions and their means of coercion, of which there are only three. We will now map the three axes of analysis we have developed onto the political triangle. The parasitic corner, what we think of as the far left, expresses the dependent feminine form of spatial liberal leftism. With high openness, low conscientiousness, reversed in-group out-group preference, and deep resentment of difference and inequality, it develops a political strategy of externalizing costs costs, outsourcing responsibility for regulation and production, and demanding redistributive subsidy through moral coercion. Because its guiding principle is equality, the parasitic left cannot tolerate anything that creates unequal distributions of authority, competence, or demonstrated excellence. Thus, particular groups and loyalties, which entail hierarchy and exclusion, must be delegitimized. The individualist corner, what we think of as libertarian, expresses the independent masculine form of spatial liberal leftism, high openness, autonomy worshipping, and resentful of unchosen ties and obligations. It develops a political strategy of evading responsibility for the production, insurance, and defense of the commons, insisting on the pricing mechanisms of the free market as the only legitimate means of coercion. The structural effect here is identical to parasitism. Once intermediary institutions are dissolved, society collapses into an aggregate of atomized individuals who require a centralized apparatus to mediate disputes, regulate exchanges, and maintain order. Thus, individualism, like parasitism, reliably produces managerial monism. Neither of them is genuinely right-wing, because neither defends the corporate, hierarchical, bounded, time-tested structures that sustain a group's evolutionary strategy. Indeed, if we go back to the historical origin of left and right, we will see that the left was the side in favor of both centralized governance and free markets. Big government and free markets have always been symbiotic pincer arms of the same spatial liberal project. Finally, we come to the absolutist corner, what we think of as authoritarian or fascist, which represents a genuinely temporal, illiberal right-wing regime, but in a monist, centralized configuration. Hierarchical, bound by loyalty and duty, and backed by the force of the state, its guiding principle is not equality or liberty, but strength. This system can be highly functional, China being the best example today, and is often the ideal during times of war or civilizational consolidation, such as in National Socialist Germany, Roman dictatorships like Lucius Sulla, the Qin unification of 3rd century BC China, etc. However, as Martin Stepan has pointed out, the political triangle expresses three versions of monism, and is thus a sort of false dichotomy. The West's true right is pluralism, which in a sense transcends the triangle. The European equilibrium I am calling pluralism does not refer to some fragmented anarchic decentralization. Pluralism in this context means that sovereignty is 1. Layered, with self-determination at every level, and 2. Distributed, with many overlapping centers of power. Michael McConkie calls this heterarchical order, as there is hierarchy but a distributed plurality of them. If the first principle of absolutist orders is strength, achieved through concentration, the first principle of pluralism is anti-fragility, a different kind of strength achieved through distributed order that enables conflict, stress, and local failure to generate learning and adaptation rather than collapse. Pluralism here means both legal pluralism, meaning multiple regionally and jurisdictionally specific systems and levels of customary law, all coexisting and constraining one another, and political pluralism, meaning multiple regionally and domain-specific centers and levels of sovereignty, forming a matrix of mutual constraint. To get a picture of what feudalism looked like, think of feudalism in the structural sense. What matters for us is not the castles and vassals, but the mesh of overlapping and interlocking authorities. In a medieval context, this looked like feudal lords with their own customs and courts, guilds with regulatory power, quality control over production, and disciplinary power over its members, chartered towns with their own particular customary laws and elders, parishes overseeing spiritual doctrine, the clergy, marriage, and family law, an overarching common law of Europe taught in the universities and used to fill gaps, and the nobility, whose power was deeply anchored in the land, their relationship to the people of the land, and the armed support of the people, who possessed, in theory and in practice, a legitimate right to constrain the power of other nobles and of the king. In this plural order, each corporate body is effectively absolutist within its own sphere, but none can totalize power because other bodies stand beside it as counter-authorities, juridicially, economically, and militarily capable of saying no. This hierarchical pluralism is the distinctively European governance and social model. It is the only structure that historically has been able to counter the tyranny of financialist oligarchs and preserved communal life, tradition, and local autonomy from exploitation by merchants, not by abolishing authority, but by multiplying authorities, each of them visible, rooted, and therefore with skin in the game and able to be held to account. Having now covered all three levels of analysis, we can see that the political left is always spatial, liberal, and monist, and the right is temporal, illiberal, and either monist or pluralist, depending on the civilizational group evolutionary strategy in question. But the function of the right is always the same: to constrain spatial drift and liberal universalism in order to safeguard the group's evolutionary strategy and preserve the group itself. In this sense, the far right is, as Mike Maxwell calls it, the deep center, the very core of the life of a people.